This video is sponsored by Tarragon Tiles.
There you are.
So Warhammer Epic, it has a long and checkered history with Games Workshop and one that I'd like to explore a little bit. Now, while you might have heard the name, you may not be particularly familiar with it. And I certainly fell into this category. I knew it was a questionably 6mm scale wargame. You play with entire armies rather than smaller companies set in the universe of Warhammer 40k. I also knew that it was old and widely unsupported in much the same way as Battlefleet Gothic is. Now, quite some time ago, our patron Carter sent us these two boxes of Warhammer Epic, and I'm going to paint through them while I dive in and explore the history of the game. So in front of me, I have a box of Space Marine tanks and a box of Space Marine infantry. The infantry sprue offers quite a lot of models, and I do note that a lot of them have already been assembled. But there is also clearly more than just one infantry sprue in these boxes that we got sent. It appears to be one full armor box, but the equivalent of 2 boxes of infantry. So I'm setting aside most of the already assembled infantry as they've actually been assembled by their previous owner incorrectly, with a lot of assault marines in the place of sergeants and infantry squad with strange numbers of rocket launchers, etc. So I'm going to use the fresh box with the minis on the sprue to make as many legal squads as I possibly can. Now, using the 3rd edition rules, there are also Devastator squads to make, and these have 2 rocket launchers, and given the abundance of tactical marines, I just use tactical marines here for the sergeants. For the armor, we have a selection of rhinos, and these are clearly based on the 2nd edition rhinos, which have over time evolved into the Demius pattern rhinos that we're aware of today. There are also 2 whirlwinds and a couple of land raiders as well. Now, of note that I found interesting with these kits is that these boxes were launched for the 1997 edition of the game. But according to the 1997 edition of the game rules, none of these boxes, or very few options in these boxes, actually provide you with full legal battalions as they are fielded. While certain things like land raiders can be used as upgrades, whirlwinds must be fielded in squads of 4, as well as terminators, scouts, spikes, etc. So beyond the devastator units and the tactical units, there's actually very little that you can assemble into legal squads from these 2 boxes. For the purpose of the year 2022, none of that's really a problem, just more of an interesting artifact of history. It's funny because overall, the older designs that we often look back at as quaint or not as nice and polished as the newer kits actually work really well at this scale. The sharper and more angular Rhino kit, which to me seems just wildly too small when at 40k scale, in these games of Epic has a more defined charm to it. It's also really cool to see models that would later become inspiration for all the modern Horus Heresy sculpts that we're seeing today. So Warhammer Epic didn't even begin its life as Warhammer Epic. It was in 1988 that Adeptus Titanicus brought the worlds of 6mm gaming to the universes of Games Workshop IP. This was the first time we saw the mighty cataclysmic conflict of titans from Warhammer 40k blasting each other across the tabletop. And while Adeptus Titanicus introduced the colossal war engines of the Legio Titans into the universe of Warhammer 40k, it didn't take long for the infantry and vehicles of the Space Marines to follow after. Released in a series of White Dwarf articles back in the glory days where White Dwarf included 10 to 20 page spreads introducing new rules and lore into the universe, the supplements allowing these miniature 6mm scale Space Marines and tanks into the games would culminate in a full box release the next year in 1989. This game was called Space Marine, and these 2 large box set games together would go on to become what we know as Warhammer Epic. This was an era where the big box games were absolutely packed in value and content and pretty much everything you needed to play. So the boxes included a range of terrain, from cardboard terrain that you would fold out and build yourself at the tables, to some foam terrain in the earlier kits. With multiple entire armies in these boxes, it wouldn't stop there. And over the next few years, rules were released for Imperial Guard, Eldar, Chaos Hordes, Squats, and Orcs. However, none of these would reach the levels of support that the Space Marines themselves did. And of particular note, this first iteration of Warhammer Epic and Adeptus Titanicus was where we first saw Imperial Knights introduced to the worlds of Warhammer 40k. First introduced entirely in White Dwarf articles, these miniatures and these early designs would go on to form the inspirations for the ever-expanding and impressive Imperial Knights line of kits that we have today. Introducing Tarragon Tiles, which is an innovative hex-based tile system made of these awesome magnetic pieces. They have a huge array of uses for all of your wargaming needs, and the limit is really just your imagination. Their recent Kickstarter was successful, and they're now taking pre-orders for their range of tiles. And there are a whole bunch of other items up for pre-order too, including their new terrain features such as trees and icicles, as well as walls to put on your tile system and provide that three-dimensional terrain for bigger scale games like Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of other tile systems use complex locking systems and physical clips that are easy to break and a pain to get apart and put together. But Tarragon is super fast, and its any configuration magnet system is really easy to use, and you can quickly change the terrain as you see fit. Maybe you decide your D&D game needs a waterfall. Well, you can add it super quickly with Tarragon tiles, cascading down and spreading across the land. Tarragon tiles are made in the USA from the finest quality rare earth magnets, and their creators are lifelong gamers like you and me who really understand the importance of modularity and reusability in their terrain setups. Personally, I can see these as being so useful in games like D&D and Pathfinder for all of those on-the-road encounters and improv situations where you need to throw down a dynamic environment really quickly that the players can sink their teeth into and enjoy. If you head over to the link in the description and check out their website and use the code TABLETOPTIME, you'll get an additional 10% off the already discounted special pre-order price for Tarragon tiles. And thank you very much for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to exploring the worlds of Epic. Or making more worlds of Epic. Maybe it's snowing. Yes, snow. Blanket the land. Now, I've painted models at similar scales before. Being a fan of the game Drop Zone Commander, I'm used to painting small infantry. And one of the great things about painting infantry at this scale is while you'd assume it would be more difficult to do a good paint job, it's actually a lot more forgiving. But now we have new tools, and one of those new tools is contrast paints. Now, contrast paints on models of this scale do a fantastic job of covering that base coat wash highlight step all in one. So I knew if I could find a really nice ultramarines color, I'd be able to cover off the bulk of the colors just with that blue. To do this, I mixed a 50-50 mix of Ultramarines blue and Talisar blue contrast paints. I find the Ultramarines blue contrast paint, despite the name, is far too dark to get the traditional look of Ultramarines, especially at this scale. Once the contrast blue had dried, I gave it a dry brush just to pick out the top surfaces and really add an extra level of detail onto these models. The next thing I did was pick out all the metallic areas with lead belcher. This classic Citadel metallic paint is the perfect mid-tone for grungy weapon metallics. On the vehicles, I painted the gun barrels, the tracks, the exhausts, and any small pieces of equipment such as the smoke launchers. But on the infantry, I actually took a different tack, painting the red elements of the model before hitting the metallics. For the red, I used Scarlet Blood to get that really vibrant second edition look. I coated this with a Karaberg Crimson wash, and I coated all the metallic areas in null oil. For the yellow highlighted areas of the model, I used Vallejo's Sun Yellow, applying one consistent coat over the thin contrast and then touching up with a second coat in the areas that needed it. I particularly enjoyed painting the black and yellow stripes for the power fists on the Terminators. Now, Murray quickly pointed out that despite the fact that I'd done it well on the Tactical Marines, on my Terminators, I'd actually painted the Ultramarine symbol upside down, which kind of reveals me as being a lifetime-long Alpha Legion player. I just couldn't resist putting my operatives in this army. I also painted an arrow to indicate the tactical squad on the top of the Rhino, and an Ultramarine symbol with the word Ultra in all bold to reflect the classic Ultramarine stylings. I'm just saying Ultra all the time. For finishing touches on these models, I used Bloody Red to highlight the red areas and give it that extra bit of pop, and Scale 75's Victorian Brass for a bunch of tiny details like the Aquillas on the Terminators and the Librarian staff. To finish off the bases of the infantry, I used some Dark Earth diorama paste to establish a foundation and then stippled on Goblin Green. I didn't want to go full Goblin Green as much as I love the classic feel, but this was kind of an homage to it while still using some modern flocking techniques. I got some very fine flocking powder powder, some PVA, and just dusted it on, and then repainted the trims of the base black, and I was finished with the paint scheme. All in all, it was an absolute treat to paint these little models. They're so fun. And while I don't see myself playing Epic anytime soon unless they re-release it for Horus Heresy, it was truly a joy to get to experience this part of the hobby. But I'm not finished here. So the fan support that Epic had received meant that in 1994, Games Workshop backed it in a big way by releasing 2 standalone box miniature games. And at the time, no one realized, but they would go on to become the most fondly remembered era of Warhammer Epic's history. Those years through 1994 all the way up to 1997. A mere 3-year window, which seems remarkably familiar with today. After the initial box game, multiple rule supplements were released, and they included rules for most of the major factions that were around in Warhammer 40k at the time. Notably including the squats in one of their last inclusions in any mainline Games Workshop release. But as with all things reflecting back to these times nowadays, what is old is new again, and I find it funny at the time of recording that we're right on the verge of a brand new full release of squats in plastic. But second edition wasn't about just releasing epic miniatures of their other larger scaled games. It also introduced 2 things that became a wider part of the 40k lore that people still get very attached to and excited about today. And that is the Imperator class Titan and the Orc Mega Gargant. First appearing in this Titan Legions box as a class of colossal war machines that only the Orcs and the Imperium could field. The Imperator Titan is often lauded as the greatest war machine in the entirety of the Imperium of Man, and is constantly talked about by diehard fans of the Titan Legions. It's probably one of the most hotly requested Titans to appear in games like Adeptus Titanicus, but we'll only see if that ever eventuates on the table. This era also saw a full redesign and update of the Imperial Knights, and in these models you can start to see a much closer example of what the modern kits were based on, with titles such as Baron and Knight being used in the rank structures within the current Imperial Knights codices, but also designs referenced such as the Paladin and the Lancer and the Warden that to varying degrees have all been adapted to brand new plastic kits. It is easy to see why this era of Epic is so fondly remembered, and with all of its success it could only go up from here, right? Now, Warhammer Epic has been abandoned since Games Workshop for over 2 decades. But online in communities, a lot of people have continued to support and adapt the game, making models available freely and at cost to people who want to 3D print them. Now, usually I would love to be able to shout out all the creators. Given the nature of everything, I decided not to. I don't want to bring the wrong kind of attention on some people who are genuinely trying to do a good thing and keep a really cool old game alive. So a personal thank you to any of you designers if you saw it. You've done great work and I really appreciate it. And with the current edition of Horus Heresy hyping me up pretty hard, I went looking for a more modern Demeus Rhino design. And in my research, I found one pretty quickly. I'd been flicking through the original 3rd edition rules of Warhammer Epic and looking at some units I could take. Razorback stuck out to me, and Dreadnoughts. But above all else, there was this really cool old model called the Space Marine Lander. It assembled much larger than I expected, and honestly, it is super cool. I really like all these models, they look awesome. But that said, there is definitely a unique charm to the original Epic models that these don't capture. I also found some 3D models of the buildings from the original Dawn of War game. These were super cool to print out, and I thought in building a full Epic army and board, they'd be really good flavoursome terrain for a Space Marine army. Pressing ahead with these models, it was time to paint them, and I followed all the same painting methods as I had with the previous models. Of note was the Dreadnought. There was a lot of incredibly small detail that it was quite hard to capture when painting at this scale. Of particular interest to me was the Space Marine Lander though. This thing is super duper cool and I absolutely love it. I kind of want a 40k scale one, as absurd as that would be. These little fiddly models were a little bit more difficult to paint than I had anticipated, certainly in terms of taking up time. So I recalculated my ambitions and set aside the goal of just painting one of each different type of thing. I don't have any current plans to play classic Epic, so rather than painting up the entire army, I decided to put a little bit more attention and focus into a nice selection of models from the whole range. So a fair way into production of this video, I remembered that I actually had a copy of Epic hiding buried at the back of a shelf in my storeroom at my shop. So here it is. Epic 40,000. This is the 1997 edition of the game. This was secondhand, so it does have, well, it certainly has the smell of an older game, but it does have a lot of the models assembled and painted in here. Of particular note and interest, there is a Games Workshop UK mail order and price list from 1996 to 1997. So if you've been looking for some spaceships for your Battlefleet Gothic army, like I know I have, I might just have the hookup that you need. For example, I'm looking for a Gothic battleship, and that'll set me back about £5. If you'd be interested in us diving through this old catalog and having a bit of a journey through the history of some of these classic minis, let me know, because I certainly think it would be an interesting video to make. So yes, it was this game that was released in 1997. And funnily enough, this Epic 40,000 is probably the first time that the word epic was the primary branding feature of the game. It combined the models and rules from Space Marine and Titan Legions into one box game which had the rules for everything. Surprisingly to Games Workshop, this change was not met with a whole lot of love. With this specific of various complex rules from models taking away some of their uniqueness, a lot of people continued to play the older edition of the game. Overall, the edition was quickly and quietly pulled from support by Games Workshop proper. Even the release of Final Liberation of Warhammer 40,000 Epic computer game, which I've actually played on the channel if you check that out, interest still could not be pulled back towards the tabletop game enough to make it a success. Something I liked and found really interesting in this game was the ability to use Battlefleet Gothic ships as sort of like a ship token that you put on the battlefield, indicating where you can do orbital strikes, etc. You pay points for these ships and got to use models from that other game. Alright, so these models have waited over 20 years to get some paint on them, so let's not keep them waiting any longer and check them out. Thank you so much to our patrons for your support. Your support continues to allow us to try more ambitious videos with higher production costs and better production values. Also, with the announcements of Gatecrash, it's been amazing to see a whole bunch of people joining to help us support the development of that game. But whatever the reason was for your joining, I would like to thank Kalan the Rogue, Connor Thompson, Nath Creep, Callum Bearman, Adam Jones, Mike Wicked, James Korn, Liara England, Luke Reggie, and Sebastian Miranda. Welcome all to the gang, and I hope you're enjoying it. Come on down and make sure you've joined the Patron Discord and hang out. Our mini review is filming next week, so if you join now, you might be able to get in on time for that Patreon exclusive. Epic 40k, what a history. Painting these models has been an absolute joy. It's been really fun to explore the retro minis as well as the small scale in general. Thank you all for coming on this journey with me. I've had a lot of fun, and if you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing down below. It really helps us. Let us know what kind of content to make and that you're enjoying the content. Let us know if you'd be interested in us exploring other retro concepts and what we should do down in those comments, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.